excited to be here and share my research with all of you. So a little bit about myself before I get started. My name is Shannan Baker. I am a third-year PhD student in church music here at Baylor University, and I am excited to present some of my research that I've done regarding community pastors and music leaders. So let's jump right in. The relationship between music leaders and pastors is important for the life of a church. While some traditions may rely solely on the pastor for service planning, many traditions have a more collaborative approach involving the music leader. Music leader will be used to describe all positions that relate to the music of the church, including worship leader, music minister, or worship pastor. The level of collaboration between the pastor and music leader may vary, but in the end, the success of this collaboration is directly related to their ability to communicate. Based on interviews conducted by my colleagues and I via Zoom in February, the lack of communication between music leaders and pastors was identified as a problem within church music today by both scholars and practitioners. Poor communication between music leaders and pastors is a problem across denominations. This paper will supplement these interviews with scholarship from a variety of traditions that demonstrates the widespread nature of this problem. The cause of poor communication between music leaders and pastors is because of an inability to speak the same language. I'll explain more about what I mean by language later in the paper. Essentially, it means music leaders do not know how to speak theology, and pastors do not know how to speak music or worship. This paper will first look at the state of training in the other language for music leaders and pastors, and then we'll suggest a way forward and steps that can be taken for church leadership to become bilingual. Communication is a skill that is cultivated over time. For communication to occur, both parties must speak in the same language. This language is not a conversational daily language such as Spanish or French, but rather a vocational language. In this case, pastors and music leaders have two separate languages. Sui Hong Lim describes the problem this way. There is not enough theological work or theological vocabulary between church musicians and pastors to actually be on the same page. Pastors speak in theological terms, musicians speak in musical terms. This miscommunication that occurs is often due to this inability to speak in any language other than their own. Though many of the scholars and practitioners interviewed are mostly from the music side of the conversation, it is important that the solution to this problem not be considered one-sided. If music leaders learn to speak theology, but pastors do not learn to speak worship, communication will still be ineffective. The solution to this communication problem is then music leaders and pastors learning to become bilingual in theology and worship. The way that this happens is through training each party in the other's language. Those who are music leaders in the church today may have different qualifications that allowed them to receive that position. Scholar James Cooper described three main avenues that one can take to receive this role: collegiately educated, performance gifted, and availability. Two of these avenues do not require formal training. In a contemporary worship setting, a person can typically fulfill the basic musical role without that training, which is why performance gifted and availability are often the way people find themselves in that role. This situation, however, is not restricted to a contemporary setting. In The Organist and Choir Master, written in 1952, Charles L. Etherington states that the intended audience of his book is not, quote, an experienced Anglican organists and choir masters, but rather church musicians who, unfamiliar with Anglican services and traditions, find themselves called upon to prepare music for the services of the church, end quote. While it is commendable that volunteers are willing to step into paid positions to fill vacancies, it is important that we consider what training might be beneficial, if not critical, for our music leaders. In an interview with music artist David Crowder, he recounts his experience at Passion City Church in Atlanta, Georgia. For their Christmas service in 2020, they included a socially distanced orchestra and large choir. After his experience with those ensembles, Crowder believes that this is the direction church music is heading, a more grandiose expression. He states, I feel like what we're starting to see visually is gonna require more education than, like I said, knowing how to strum 1, 4, 5 minor 6. For Crowder, this grander expression involving more voices and musicians playing more intricate music is going to require more musical training. Even this statement implies that some music leaders do not currently have this musical training. Many job descriptions for music ministers and worship leader positions often do not require a higher level of education than a bachelor's degree. Depending on the church, this requirement may even be further reduced to only preferred. Within the SBC, or Southern Baptist Convention denomination, Kenneth Bohr did a research study that found that only 31.4% of the full-time job descriptions required education, with 30.2 specifically mentioning music training. The lack of a requirement in music education is something that the church will need to reconsider, especially if Crowder is right that the church is heading towards a grander expression in worship. If worship leaders or music ministers do decide to get training, what are the options available to them and what will they learn? The obvious component of an undergraduate degree in music is music training. This paper will focus on the bachelor's degrees because of the absence of an education requirement by churches. Because universities require accreditation, music curriculums, including those for church-related degrees, these will include classes in music history, theory, oral skills, conducting, and applied lessons. Beyond the music core, universities provide courses that are specific to each major or concentration. Many Christian university music programs are accredited by the National Association for Schools of Music, from here on after called NASM. NASM provides guidelines and criteria for each type of degree. This table includes a condensed version of the requirements for each type of degree available for church music-related majors. NASM provides criteria separately for both liberal arts and professional degrees. Because of the liberal arts' large focus on general studies, these degrees actually have more flexibility in what can be included in their curriculum. At these institutions, the music-related courses are usually only 30 to 45% of the degree. For the professional degrees, there are two different options for universities: sacred music, or church music, and worship studies, or worship leadership. The major difference between these two degrees is the weight given to the music portion of the degree. For the BM in sacred music, the major area and supportive music courses comprise over 65% of the degree. The BM in worship studies, however, offers more opportunities beyond music because the music portion of the degree is 50% and 15 to 20% of the degree is focused on other topics, such as the Bible, theology, and ministry, that are not necessarily music related. Institutions that offer a BM in sacred music will likely not have space in the curriculum for additional classes related to the Bible or theology. As mentioned previously, church music and sacred music programs are either concluding or transitioning into worship studies programs. This seems like a logical solution to the communication problem I mentioned at the beginning. There are two main competencies required by NASM that makes the worship studies degree different from the sacred music degree. Competency C addresses the communication problem specifically by requiring students to have a knowledge in other fields, such as theology. While this may be a requirement for the worship studies degree, the way a university meets those requirements will still vary. Alan Hendricks, in his dissertation, compared the curriculums of different music-based worship degrees. Christian studies is the category he used to include all Bible and theology courses. In total, he examined 12 different institutions. For half of the universities, the Bible courses were included in the general education requirements for that school. John Brown University and Cedarville University required a theology of worship course beyond the general education requirements. Cedarville also required a course in the Psalms. Other inclusions beyond these gen ed requirements included a practical theology course at Azusa Pacific University and a systematic theology course at Anderson University in South Carolina. While Hendricks' research is now almost 10 years old, it does show how the worship programs expand beyond music education. If students are required to learn about theology, then they are being required to learn how to speak in a language other than music. The students who graduate with these degrees will leave bilingual in both music and theology. This does not mean that they will be at the same level of understanding as a pastor who graduates from seminary, but they will have a basic understanding that allows them to converse conversationally in the language of theology. As mentioned previously, this communication gap cannot be repaired from one side. Lead pastors, unlike music leaders, are often required to have an MDiv degree or an equivalent. This requirement holds pastors to a higher standard regarding education. While some traditions may not require every pastor on staff to have an MDiv degree, this is often required for the pastor who will be preaching regularly to the congregation. Congregations expect their pastors to be able to read and interpret the Bible and preach to them every week. In order to do that, pastors attend seminaries where they learn about the Bible, theology, church history, pastoral care, biblical languages, and preaching. The one thing that is not included by all seminaries is education in worship, and even more rare is a musical education. Paul Westermeyer states, "Despite some delightful exceptions, American clergy generally know little about church music, hymnody, and even worship. Part-time musicians, even ones with little training, often know more about these topics than do clergy. This statement is not so much an indictment of the clergy as it is an indictment of the American seminaries." Westermeyer does not place the blame on the pastors, but focuses on the seminaries, the training grounds for pastors. While I am not specifically advocating that pastors need to be able to lead music, Westermeyer includes that clergy need to understand worship too. Worship is the easiest point of entry into the conversation for pastors. Pastors may never lead the congregation in singing a song, but they play an active role in the worship of the church. This is especially seen in the portions of the liturgy regarding the sacraments. The Lord's Supper, even if only received monthly or quarterly or occasionally, is an important practice still in the life of the church. From the table, the pastor leads the congregation in worship through the sacrament. The reason pastors should understand the whole service liturgy, including the sections that they are not performing, such as the musical sections, is because the sacrament of Holy Communion is placed within that structure. Even in churches that do not follow a prescribed liturgy, the pastor should have an awareness and understanding of what happens in the rest of the service in order to collaborate and communicate with the music leader. As Westermeyer appropriately looked to the seminaries for this training, we will also examine how the seminaries are training pastors. Jack Schwartz wrote his dissertation on the state of church music education for ministerial students in Protestant seminaries in the United States. In 1975, what he found was not encouraging for repairing this gap in communication. Only 30.4% of the institutions required students to enroll in a course that is related to church music. The option to even take a class related to church music was only offered in just over 2/3 of the schools he surveyed. seminaries even admitted that they inadequately prepare their students in church music. Schwartz found that, quote, only 15% of the administrators considered graduates of their schools to be adequately prepared to deal effectively with music in their pastoral ministries, end quote. 45 years after that survey, the state of worship education of our pastors has not improved. In a brief survey of the top 12 largest seminaries in the country, based on the full-time equivalent student enrollment as reported by the Association of Theological Schools, only 5 seminaries offered a worship course in their core curriculum, and only 3 of those 5 seminaries required it. That means at the largest seminaries in America, less than 50% offer education in worship, and only 25% require it. It is no surprise then that there is a communication barrier between music leaders and pastors. If pastors are not taught about any other part of the service other than the role they play in preaching the word and leading the sacraments, then they are unable to effectively communicate with music leaders. Without this education, some pastors could fall into the trap of viewing the musical time of worship as leading up to the main event, the sermon, as mentioned previously as a result of the Great Awakening. There is a lack of appreciation for the function music plays, and collaboration between pastors and music leaders is therefore made even more difficult. Once pastors become aware of the crucial role that music plays in the life of the congregation, then the communication between pastors and music leaders can be restored. By becoming bilingual in music, in worship and theology, music leaders and pastors can communicate effectively and unite to create worship services that are unified and fruitful for their congregations. Music leaders do not need to learn how to preach. Preaching pastors do not need to learn how to play an instrument. They need to learn to speak in the language of the other, not replicate the practice. Charlotte Croker uses the same vocabulary, stating, "The easiest and most efficient working arrangements are those where the clergy and musicians share common theological and musical language." While I think musical language is helpful, I think it is more important for the pastor to speak in the language of worship and or liturgy, if in a high church setting. Pastors need to be able to communicate regarding the role music plays in a service, and music leaders need to be able to communicate and recognize the theological role that music plays in congruence with the theological preaching of the pastor. Croker echoes this sentiment when describing the basic knowledge needed if cross-training is not available for a music minister. Pastors and music leader collaboration extends beyond church service planning. Historically, pastors have been involved in the songwriting process, either writing hymns themselves or collaborating with songwriters. Pastors can help guide musicians theologically in the songwriting process. In an interview with Tanya Riches from Hillsong College, she notes, the processes that the songwriters have is wanting to ask questions when they're writing those lyrics. Should we go with A or B? And if you are the person on the other end of the WhatsApp message, then you can kind of add your theology, but in a much more applied way. I think that's a better way of collaboration than trying to get them in a room and have them do theologically oriented conferences where they're just bored. Lester Ruth furthers this idea that songwriters, quote, see theologians as someone who can help them avoid errors, end quote. He actually adds, I think robust theological conversations can do much more than help you avoid mistakes. While I agree that theological conversations have much more to offer, this is under the assumption that the songwriters are allowing theologians or pastors in the songwriting room. Ruth provides insight into why theologians might be left out based on a conversation he had with Sui Hung Lim. He says, I asked Sui Hung, I said, why is it that so many of the songwriters seem afraid of being theological? And Sui Hung, who's a composer himself and a music professor at Emmanuel College, University of Toronto, told me this was his reply. He said, "I think a lot of the songwriters are afraid that if they become theological, they'll lose their passion for God." It is important for us to restore the line of communication of pastors and theologians with songwriters and music leaders. If music leaders are already getting trained in theology, this will allow for them to communicate more easily with pastors in this process. Recognizing the theology in worship songs is crucial in the songwriting process. Tanya Riches thinks that there may be an awareness of this within the music industry. She says maybe some of those conferences that people have been attending have been landing in some ways because there are lots of industry figures who are asking really important theological questions. So hopefully those two ends meet and we can start to see a little bit more integration. This hope is echoed by Lester Ruth and his aspirations for including a variety of Bible scholars, musicians, and theologians in one songwriting room. Both Riches and Ruth are scholars in worship studies, but they have high hopes for what could happen in church music if only the people from seemingly polarized positions would work together. Both of them are focused on theology entering the music world. Pastors, though, can help in this process more if they are musically inclined or even have an awareness about how the musical elements are utilized in a worship service. Pastors with worship knowledge and music leaders with theological knowledge would create not only a room where people can communicate, but the conversation can move beyond misunderstandings and explanations to the content of what is being created. Ultimately, the solution to this problem is to become bilingual. Again, not in conversational languages, but in vocational languages. Pastors should be able to speak about worship, and music leaders need to be able to speak about theology. In learning about what the other does, a greater appreciation can grow and the possibilities for the church are endless. In an interview with Paul Westermeyer, he said, quote, "Where the two realize they have different roles, one is to preside and preach, one is to worry about the church's song, where they have different understanding, their vocations, and they work together, there is hope." Again, the goal is not to have music leaders preach or to have pastors lead music. The goal is simply to restore the communication that has been broken because of the inability to speak the same language. If church leaders have been in the field for a long time and do not receive the proper training, Croker proposes a solution. Dialogue, a genuine conversation, results in good communication between clergy and musician, even when neither has substantial training in the other's field, provided they share an appreciation and respect for each other. Respect is a key element in Eileen Gunther's book, as noted by Paul Westermeyer in the foreword. He says, quote, "Respect is generated by open, honest give and take, exhibited by competent people who understand their complementary roles and work together for the common good." In order for these leaders to gain respect for one another, they need to learn more about what the other does. For example, sacred music curricula can include more biblical and theological classes or transition to a worship studies major where those classes are already included. And seminaries can require MDiv students to take courses in worship. Sui Hung Lim goes even further in proposing that these two separate groups could even learn in the same room. He says, if musicians and theological students are studying in the same classroom, having the same lecture, having the same curriculum, then that would iron out a whole lot of problems. This communication problem is far from being solved. Institutions are slow to make changes because of accreditation requirements, even if those changes would allow for the communication between pastors and music leaders to improve. Now that NASM includes guidelines for a worship studies major, That allows for non-music related courses to be included. Music programs have started to make changes toward worship studies majors that include education in Bible and theology. Seminaries, however, have seen very little progress in music education and further neglect any courses in worship that are not music related. In other parts of the world, education is valued higher than in the United States. In an interview with Esther Widiasi from Indonesia, she explained the high value that they place on music training. This situation in Indonesia is very different than the job descriptions mentioned earlier that do not list education even as a requirement for a music leader job. For pastors, Tanya Rich's interview provided insight into the high value Australia puts on pastoral education. The culture in which we find ourselves will heavily influence our approach towards education. In both Indonesia and Australia, people are placing a high value on education, and that is being reflected in the church. The future of this conversation may require a deeper look into the values of education and how pastors and music leaders are being trained in the United States. Unfortunately, there is not a common language to both worship and theology. While they are both immensely important and inform one another, they are still separate vocabularies. For pastors and music leaders to learn to communicate, they must become bilingual. Pastors must speak in worship terms, music leaders must speak in theological terms. In order to become bilingual, pastors and music leaders must receive the training to do so. While this seems like it would be an easy solution, imagine trying to have a conversation after reading one book of Spanish or taking one course of Spanish. Learning a language takes time. Pastors do not need to be able to critically think in worship terms, and music leaders do not need to be able to have deep theological conversations. They only need a functional conversational understanding of the language in order to collaborate well with one another. If pastors and music leaders can learn to communicate, then the church can begin to move in a direction that is more well-rounded, both theologically and worshipfully. Thank you. So let me stop sharing my screen here. If I can figure out how to do that. Here we go. There's the button. So I know that's a lot of information to take in, and a lot of statistics and a lot of ideas from a variety of interviewees. But I'm curious to kind of see where those of us who are in this session together, kind of what your experience has been as music leaders with whether you plan with your pastor or whether you don't. So in order to, I know I can't see all of you, unfortunately, but hopefully we can use the chat, and I've got a couple polls that I want to just kind of see where we're all at together. So the first poll I have is based around, so it's just asking who plans your church's worship services. So is it the pastor only, just the music minister? Is it the pastor and the music minister together? Is there a worship planning team? What do those relationships look like? This is also my first time trying to use this poll feature, so we will see how this goes. If it doesn't work, we might just switch over to the chat. All right. Again, first time trying out this poll thing. I don't know if it'll work. Okay, we got some, I think there's just a delay. Okay, so we've got some that are just the music minister only, a lot of more of you are the pastor and music minister together, so this is especially important in those situations where you're planning together. It's really, really important to have good communication. Great, so I'm just gonna end that poll. So for me to, again, just learn more about what that looks like. So especially those of you who are planning with your pastor. So as a music minister, you're planning with your pastor. I've got another poll here, and even those of you who said you plan by yourself, just another poll that's asking, as a music leader, how would you describe your current relationship with your pastor? So I've got 4 different options there. Do you work well together and respect one another? Do you work together, but maybe there's some tension and you're not getting along and there's not a whole lot of respect or appreciation? And then if you don't work together, do you still respect one another, or is there some tension? Again, I think there's mostly just like a delay in when you put in your answers and when I actually see them. Great. So we've got, okay, so some of you are saying you work together, there's some tension. It's where a majority of you are. Got a couple people don't work together, but at least still respect one another, so that's great. Maybe the reason why there's no tension is you don't work together. But yeah, so a lot of you are finding kind of what I was talking about and what a lot of these interviewees pointed out, that especially when you work together, there's this tension and this weird problem and challenge when we've got pastors and music ministers trying to work together to achieve this goal. And I hope that in identifying what I think the problem is, I really do think that the problem is you're talking at one another, but you don't have that vocabulary to understand what the other is saying. And so you just are talking over one another and you don't actually know enough about what the other person does to be able to speak in that language to really have that good communication. So just one last question in the poll that that I'm curious about, and then we can kind of use the chat for some Q&A. But just a last question. So if there is this gap, so based on my research, I found that a lot of music ministers are not trained in the Bible or theology. And again, I did say that this is not a one-sided solution to this problem, but this is a music minister conference, so you are the people I have here. Otherwise, I'd go talk to the pastors, or really the seminaries. But just another poll here. As the music leader, were you trained or educated in the Bible and theology? And have you found that useful if you have been? All right, I'm seeing a lot of you are saying that you have been, and it has been helpful. All right, we got one person who's not, but wish they were. There's still, it's never too late to learn, so can always learn more. All right, so we're about half and half between yes, we have been and it's been helpful, and no, I haven't been, but I wish I was. So thank you for filling out those polls. That gives me an idea of who we are here. If we were in person, I'd be able to see your faces and get to know all of you a little bit more. But for those of you who are saying you have been educated in the Bible and theology and it has been helpful, maybe in the chat, I've got just another question because I'm curious about this. Has it been helpful in creating good communication between your pastor, or what seems to still create that tension if you're one of the people who says that there's tension? Okay, Betsy says part of the problem is ego. Okay, so the pastor just views themselves as the main event, and you're the music minister who's trying to plan with a person who thinks that they're the only thing that matters. So yes, that can cause a lot of problems. Unfortunately, my bilingual situation will only work if the the pastor themselves also sees the need to understand what we do as music ministers and can learn to appreciate our part of it as well. So yes, really good. Also, just in the chat, for those of you who are seeing the problems, do you think what I presented is the solution? Do you think that's a good solution? Do you think it won't work? I'm just curious there. I know if the problem's ego, yes, it might not fully work because a one-sided solution is not going to solve the problem. Well, do any of you have any questions for me that maybe I can help answer based on my research and experience? I know a lot of you in this session have much more experience in ministry than I do, which I will gladly learn from maybe what's worked for you with working with your pastors, and I can provide some attempt at some answers if you have any questions about anything that I presented. Yeah, Betsy, me too. I really do hope. Unfortunately, it's a very slow solution, and you have to have people who believe that they need to learn about what the other person does, right? So the goal of all of the learning isn't just establishing communication. It's really aiming towards gaining a deeper appreciation for what the other person does. So I would encourage you, yes, and that's actually what I was just gonna say, Betsy. Yeah, if you're able to have some of that more appreciation and even just some like good theological training where you're talking to the pastor and the pastor is be able to affirm what the decisions that you're making, yeah, you can really create just a better relationship there. All right, Stuart, you say, for me, if there's a communication difference, it's usually a personality difference. Okay, more than a worship versus theology difference. Our personalities communicate in different ways. Yes, so this communication gap could definitely have many personality components. People communicate in different ways. People communicate in differing amounts. Certain people love to communicate with a lot of details, and other people really choose to communicate with bare minimum details. So yeah, there's a lot of differing personalities that can also create some of that gap. Really good insights. I would say, thinking about communication as a whole, so I presented one solution to hopefully solving the appreciation side of this lack of communication. If we can respect and appreciate one another, hopefully that will help restore some of these relationships. But I do think personality is another huge contributor to being able to also respect one another and the way that we work together. If you're able to better understand another person, that can really help with some of those communication issues. And I know in a lot of these instances, I'm preaching to the choir with all of the music ministers here. So I can only encourage us so much, and hopefully the pastors will realize their role in affirming what we do, and learning more about how we plan things and put things together and choose music, to hopefully also just gain that deeper level of respect. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for me? With this message. That's a good question. I wish I had a poll. So Betsy here says, how many of you have had the pastor say that he doesn't give much information about where he's going with his message, and that they don't even care if the worship parts don't work together? If anyone in the chat has had that experience, feel free to agree. It sounds like, Betsy, that's your situation, and I am very sorry that that's the situation that you find yourself in. Yeah, Patty feels the same way, has been in that situation. Yeah, my best friend has been kind of in that same situation where he just kind of micromanages and was telling her what songs to put where. And so on the other end of that, sometimes it's not helpful if it's supposed to be the music minister's job, but the pastor's now taking over and trying to do it all for them too. So there's two sides to that coin. They don't care at all, or they almost care too much that they're starting to just do the job. Yeah. Any other questions for me? There's also a Q&A feature if you don't want to put it in the chat. I think we can use that if you wanted to ask a question anonymously. Again, I'm just kind of learning this platform like all of you, coming to the end of our Alleluia time together. Good, Betsy. I'm so glad. Honestly, I think that's the biggest thing that I learned in my research is, we think that it's just the music leaders who need to learn more about the theology and the Bible, but really, and looking at how seminaries are training pastors, there's a big gap there where they're just not taught the value of music in a worship service. So yeah, it's frustrating. So I'm glad that we're able to show you some solidarity in this problem. Yeah, Stuart, sometimes there's going to be, songs that just don't go along with the sermon. And other times the topic will align more easily. There's, in those moments when you can't find songs that go along with the sermon, that does make it a little more difficult. But at least you're in a church where your pastor is able to still encourage you to attempt to create something that's worshipful and still values the music side of what's happening, even if you can't get it to align. Stuart, one of the few. So Stuart has a pastor who has a degree in church music, which definitely changes the way that relationship will work. If you're both able to be in that same understanding, I mean, that's almost, I mean, he's a pastor, but he did get the church music training, but it's kind of the exact solution to the communication problem. You know, if he's been trained in church music, he has become bilingual through his theological training and his musical training. So that's really the ideal. Yeah, Betsy, that's a great strategy when you can't find songs that fit with the theme. Liturgical seasons and church calendars are a very helpful resource when trying to get things to yeah, go along well. Yes. As long as he doesn't take charge of what you do. It's good. Very good. Anyone else have any questions or comments? I feel like our session has become a little bit of a support group for bad relationships and communications between music ministers and pastors, but hopefully solutions are in the future. You know, I have these conversations with my colleagues all the time here at Baylor about ways that we long to see the church improve and long to see the church grow and get better. And this is definitely one of those things. So relationally, we can always become more like Christ and always seek to approach our tasks with grace for one another and respect. So, well, that's all I have for us today. I was supposed to present with someone else, but scheduling things made me the only one here. So, yeah, hopefully, if nothing else, I hope you leave this session encouraged and supported, that you are not alone if you're in a situation where relationships are not always the best or the smoothest. But be encouraged, because God will use you either way, and continue to be faithful in your calling. So.